Japan. It's a culture you can never miss. No matter which part of the world you're in, you've probably encountered some part of Japanese culture, whether it's the food or the iconic anime that everyone seems to love. But today we're diving into the dark side of Japan, the scariest stories, tales, and folklore that have been passed down through generations. Now let's dive straight in. Story 1. Jorōgumo. Jorōgumo, also known as the Binding Bride, is a shape-shifting spider demon from Japanese folklore. Legends tell of a massive spider that can transform into a beautiful woman, to lure unsuspecting men into her web, once enchanted by her beauty. These men are trapped, paralyzed by her venom, and slowly devoured. In a quiet village nestled deep within the mountains, locals there whispered about a mysterious woman who appeared by the river. Hikaru, a young fisherman, first saw her on a misty morning as he cast his nets. Her striking beauty captivated him. She had long, flowing hair and a kimono that shimmered in the dawn light. She smiled at him, and Hikaru instantly felt a pull stronger than any he'd ever known before. Day after day, he would return to the river, where the woman waited for him. She was always by the same ancient-looking tree. She never spoke, but her presence alone was enough for Hikaru. One evening, Hikaru decided to go look for her, determined to talk to her. He took his boat looking for her, but she was not there. But just as the sun dipped below the horizon, he saw her. With her hands, she signaled to him to follow her into the forest. He immediately docked his boat and ran into the forest towards the same direction she went. The deeper he went, the denser the forest became, until he arrived at an old, abandoned house. There he saw her, standing inside facing away from him. As Hikaru stepped closer, he felt something sticky brush against his arm. The woman then suddenly turned, her eyes staring at him, glowing in the dark. Hikaru then realized that it was too late. Her once beautiful face had twisted into a monstrous grin. Her kimono unraveled into thousands of thin, glistening threads, and her body transformed into a grotesque spider, larger than a man. Hikaru tried to run, but his legs were captured by the web that now had covered the house. His screams were muffled as the jorogumo descended, wrapping him tighter and tighter until the forest was silent once more. Story 2. Akanto. The akanto, or the red cloak, is a spirit that is said to haunt public restrooms, particularly those in old, dingy buildings. Legend says that the akanto appears as a tall figure wearing a flowing red cloak and a mask that hides his face. He is said to always offer his victims a choice between a red paper or a blue paper, and those who answer the question would meet a gruesome fate, regardless of which paper they choose. Sakura had just moved to Japan from America. She quickly made friends and settled into her new life as a student. However, she had always been skeptical of the stories her friends would tell about the old school building that seemed to be abandoned. Being her mature self, she knew that the ghost of Manto was just a tale to scare kids, and a way to prevent kids from wandering off into the old building. Sakura was also known for her dedication to her art, often losing track of time as she meticulously perfected each stroke on the canvas. That day was no different. She found herself alone in the farthest corner of the school grounds. Tucked away in the old art room, the others had long since packed up and left, their laughter and chatter fading into the distance as they hurried home. But Sakura stayed behind, as she had a lot of catching up to do. The art room was quiet now. Only the sound of her brush against the canvas broke the silence. The room, filled with half-finished projects and the faint smell of paint, had always been a place of comfort for her. But as the hours ticked by, an unsettling stillness began to settle in. The usual hum of activity that filled the school during the day was replaced by an eerie calm. Suddenly, a low rumble of thunder echoed from outside. Sakura looked up from her work. Through the large windows, she could see the sky darkening. Thick, heavy clouds rolled in, blocking out the late afternoon sun. The wind picked up, rattling the windows as it swept across the deserted school grounds. It was clear that a storm was on the way. Realizing she would have to walk home in the rain, Sakura decided it was time to leave. She began to pack up her things, moving quickly as the sky grew darker. The thought of walking through the storm unnerved her. But just as she slung her bag over her shoulder, she felt a sudden pressing need to use the restroom. In the main building, where the newer facilities were located, was a good distance away. With the storm approaching fast, Sakura didn't want to waste time heading all the way there. Then she remembered the old restroom in the abandoned part of the school. It was closer, though few students ever went there. The building was in disrepair, and stories of ghosts and strange occurrences had made it a place of fear and superstition. Without giving it much thought, she decided to use the old restroom. It was quicker, and she wanted to be on her way before the storm hit. As she stepped out of the art room and into the hallway, the buildings around her seemed even more deserted than before. Each step echoed in the empty corridor. The flickering fluorescent lights cast long shadows, and the air felt heavy with the impending storm. A sense of unease crept over her, but she brushed it aside. She quickened her pace, determined to get in and out as quickly as possible. Pushing open the door to the old building, Sakura was immediately struck by the change in atmosphere. The air was colder, and a musty smell hung in the air. The old walls groaned as the wind howled outside. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through the grimy windows. She could see the restroom door just ahead. It looked just as dilapidated as the rest of the building. The paint peeling off and the handle rusted. Despite the growing sense of dread, Sakura continued forward. She pushed open the restroom door, which creaked loudly on its hinges. The inside was even worse than she had imagined. The cracked tiles on the floor, the grime-covered mirrors, and the dim, flickering light made the place feel even more unsettling. Sakura hurried into the last stall, eager to finish quickly and leave, but as she was about to exit, a deep, raspy voice echoed through the restroom. Red paper, or blue paper. Sakura's breath hitched in her throat. The voice was unmistakable, deep, almost inhuman, reverberating through the silent restroom. She froze, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. She could feel the cold sweat trickling down her spine. The stories her friends had told began to flood her mind. Despite her earlier skepticism, a cold wave of fear washed over her.
Red paper, or blue paper.
The voice repeated. This time it was closer, more insistent. The words seemed to hang in the air, each syllable dripping with malice. Her mind raced. She remembered the warnings. No matter what you choose, you meet a gruesome fate. The stories varied, but they all ended the same way. Blood and terror. Her fingers trembled as she tried to unlock the stall door, but it wouldn't budge. The rusty lock seemed to have jammed, trapping her inside. Panic clawed at her. She whispered back, saying that she doesn't want any paper. Her voice barely audible. She prayed it was the right thing to say. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, she feared the entity hadn't heard her. Or worse, that her answer had angered it. Suddenly, the pressure in the room seemed to shift. The temperature dropped even further. Sakura felt an icy breath on the back of her neck, as if someone or something was standing right behind her. She shut her eyes tightly, willing herself not to turn around. The door to the stall then suddenly creaked open. As soon as it was open, big enough for her to leave, Sakura didn't wait to see what was behind it. She bolted out of the restroom, her legs carrying her faster than she thought possible. The hallway outside seemed even darker than before, the shadows stretching out like long, grasping hands. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. as she burst through the door of the old building and into the open air. The first raindrops began to fall. The storm had finally arrived, but she barely noticed. She ran all the way home, not daring to look back. The wind howled around her, but she was too consumed by the terror of what she had just escaped, or days after. Sakura couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, lurking just beyond her vision. She stopped going to the old school building entirely. No one knew why she avoided it. She never told anyone what happened that night. A few weeks later, the school announced that the old restroom would be permanently sealed off due to structural issues. But those who knew the stories whispered among themselves that it wasn't just the building's age that led to the closure. Story 3. Teke Teke. Alright, so let's dive into another intriguing piece of Japanese folklore. Now this one's definitely on the darker side, so buckle up. Teke Teke is a spirit with a truly tragic backstory. Legend has it that she was a young woman who met a horrifying fate when she was struck by a train. The accident was so severe that it sliced her body clean in half. What makes this legend even more chilling is the way she's said to haunt the world. After the accident, Teke Teke's upper body became her main form of movement. She's known for dragging her torso along the ground and making a distinct sound as she moves. Her spirit now roams train stations and railways, seeking revenge on anyone who crosses her path. Kenji had just finished high school and was about to start college. To save up for a holiday trip with his friends next month, he decided to take on a temporary job. He found a position that paid well, but it was located at the far end of town, so he had to take the train every day. The distance didn't bother him much because the pay was worth it. His job required him to work night shifts, from the afternoon until midnight. Kenji enjoyed the peace and quiet of the night, and he liked the solitude, so he was pretty content with the arrangement. Over the past 2 weeks, he'd become accustomed to the late-night routine. The last train was usually very quiet, and Kenji was often the only passenger. Sometimes he'd see a few other people, but they were rare. On this particular night, Kenji finished his shift, locked up the store, and headed to the train station. He sat at the very end of the train station, where he always waited for the train. This spot was convenient because the stairs he used to access the platform were right there. So, it made sense for him to stay at this end, rather than walk to the middle of the station. Kenji sat on the bench at the end and waited for the train. As he glanced around, he noticed something unusual. At the far end of the station, on the opposite end from where he was sitting, there was a figure standing there. While seeing people at the station wasn't uncommon for Kenji, it was strange to see someone standing at that far end. There were no stairs nearby at that end of the platform, so it wasn't a spot someone would typically choose to stand. This person must have walked a considerable distance to reach that spot deliberately. Kenji squinted to get a better look, and noticed that this person was very short, almost too short to be an adult. He thought it might be a kid, but it was unusual for a child to be out this late, especially after midnight. Kenji checked his watch and saw it was almost 12:30. He shrugged off the oddity, as he was tired and not in the mood to be concerned about it. He decided to ignore it and just wait for his train. As he waited, Kenji found himself glancing over at the figure every so often. What struck him as particularly odd was that the person wasn't moving at all. The figure remained perfectly still, as if frozen in place. Kenji couldn't see the person's face clearly from this distance, but the silhouette was unmistakable. The person stood there, staring straight ahead at the train tracks without any sign of movement. Kenji thought this was strange because when he'd seen other people at the station before, they usually gave a nod or some kind of acknowledgement. This person, however, remained completely still, which felt eerie. Despite feeling a bit unsettled, Kenji tried to push the thought out of his mind. He decided to focus on waiting for the train and kept his attention on his own business. When the train finally arrived, Kenji boarded as he usually did, heading to the first coach since he was at the front of the station. As he entered the train, he caught a glimpse of the figure out of the corner of his eye. The person was heading toward the last coach, which made sense since they were standing at the far end of the platform. What struck Kenji as odd was the way the figure moved. Their entrance into the coach was anything but smooth. The movements were jerky and unnatural, almost as if they were struggling or had some kind of impairment. Despite the unsettling sight, Kenji shrugged it off. He figured the person might have a walking disability or simply be extremely tired. He didn't think too much of it and continued to make his way to his usual spot on the train. Kenji stepped into the train and quickly found his usual spot. He sat down, feeling the familiar sensation of the train's seat beneath him. Within a few minutes, the train doors slid shut with a soft hiss, and the carriage began to move. He let out a small sigh of relief, glad to finally be on his way home after a long day. As the train began to pick up speed, Kenji settled in, trying to shake off the odd encounter at the station. He stared out of the window, watching the dark landscape blur by. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to relax, the gentle rocking of the train lulling him into a state of calm. The earlier unease started to fade, replaced by the comforting rhythm of the train's movement. Just as Kenji began to relax, a soft creaking sound caught his attention. He tensed up slightly, his ears straining to catch any other unusual noises. The train was usually quiet at this hour, with only the occasional hum of the tracks beneath it. The creaking sound continued, faint but persistent, like something was being dragged slowly within the carriage. Kenji's eyes darted towards the source of the sound, but the dim lighting inside the train made it difficult to see clearly. His mind raced back to the strange figure he had seen earlier. Kenji tried to convince himself it was nothing, just the train settling as it sped along the tracks. But the sound didn't stop, and an uncomfortable feeling began to creep back into his mind. He couldn't help but wonder if the figure he'd seen at the station was somehow involved. As the creaking sound grew heavier, it became unmistakably clear that it was more than just the train settling. It was a dragging sound, like something heavy was being pulled along the floor of the carriage. Kenji's heart began to race, his mind, already on edge from the strange figure he'd seen, now spiraled into overthinking. What could that be? Is it that person? That strange figure from the platform moving towards me? Then, Kenji remembered something that both reassured and terrified him at the same time. He knew this train route well, having taken it every night for the past 2 weeks. He recalled that in a few moments, the train would hit a section where it would make a sharp bend. During that turn, passengers could briefly catch a glimpse of the opposite side of the train through the windows. Kenji realized that this upcoming bend would give him a chance to see what was causing the dragging sound. His breath caught in his throat at the thought. He would soon find out if it was that strange figure moving through the train, or if it was something else entirely. As the train took the sharp bend, Kenji leaned forward, trying to get a clear view through the windows. His eyes scanned the last coach, where he had seen the figure enter. But to his surprise, it was empty. There was no one there. A chill ran down his spine as he realized that the figure had somehow moved. He kept his eyes glued to the windows, searching for any sign of the strange person. Then, in the dim lighting of the train, he saw it. The figure had moved 2 coaches up. It was now standing at the front of the third last coach, eerily still, yet somehow advancing closer to Kenji. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched the figure, a mix of dread and disbelief washing over him, despite the distance and the several coaches between them. Kenji felt a growing fear gnawing at him. The figure was moving towards him, and he still had 6 more stations to go before reaching his stop. Kenji's mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. Should he change his seat? Should he try to get off at the next station? But the idea of stepping off the train, only to have the figure follow him, was even more terrifying. He could only sit there, frozen in fear, as the train continued its journey through the night, and the figure likely slowly closing the distance between them. After a while, Kenji tried to convince himself that it was just a coincidence and that the person was simply pacing back and forth. But the relentless way it seemed to advance toward him made it impossible to ignore the dread pooling in his stomach. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one darker than the last. He couldn't help but think about all the horror stories he had seen in the news about late-night encounters with murderers and psychos that ended in tragedy. What if this was one of those moments? What if he was about to become just another headline in a cautionary tale regarding safety? The thought sent a shiver down his spine, and he instinctively clutched his bag tighter, as if it could somehow protect him from the unknown. Kenji was fully aware that the next bend was coming up, so he braced himself to check again. His eyes locked on the far end of the coach. To him, the dragging noise was getting louder, almost as if it were right behind him. But he was hoping that it was only his imagination. At this point, he could barely breathe as he waited for the train to turn, praying that the figure had stopped and that it wasn't actually coming for him. But as the train took the bend, Kenji's worst fears were confirmed. The figure had moved 2 coaches closer, now only a few coaches away from entering his coach. His panic spiked, adrenaline surging through his veins as he grabbed his things and bolted to the far end of the coach, pressing his back against the cold metal wall, his body tense and his heart pounding. The dragging sound was now so close that he could almost feel it reverberating through the floor beneath his feet. The door of his coach suddenly slid open with a soft hiss. It was an automatic door, which meant only one thing. Something or someone was nearby. Yet when Kenji looked around, he saw nothing. But the dragging sound persisted, inching closer, echoing ominously in the otherwise silent train. Kenji's breath quickened, panic clawing at his insides as he tried to figure out what to do. He didn't know what was coming for him, but he knew it was getting closer. His mind raced, and then he realized. The train was approaching the next station. He could see the dim lights of the platform flickering in the distance, and he prayed silently that the station would arrive before whatever was approaching reached him. The train began to slow down, and just as the station came into view, the door to the coach opened. Kenji didn't hesitate. He bolted from his seat and ran out onto the platform, but just before he could escape completely, he caught a glimpse of something that sent a jolt of terror through his entire body. There, just behind him, was the figure. A woman, or what was left of her. She was crawling on the ground, her body twisted in a grotesque manner. Her arms pulled her along as her torso dragged behind, revealing a trail of blood smeared across the floor of the train. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, with dark, empty eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. Her mouth was twisted into a haunting grin, lips parted just enough to reveal broken, jagged teeth. Her lower half was missing, severed cleanly at the waist, leaving only a bloody, ragged stump where her legs should have been. The sight was horrifying, but what truly froze Kenji in place was the speed at which she moved. Despite her lack of legs, she dragged herself forward with an unnatural swiftness. She was clearly the source of the relentless dragging sound that had haunted him throughout the journey. Kenji stood there, motionless, for only a split second, his brain struggling to process the horror before him. But then, survival instincts kicked in. He turned and sprinted off the train, running as fast as his legs could carry him. He didn't stop, not even to look back. The platform blurred as he ran out of the station and onto the street, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He kept running, knowing he needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere familiar. He didn't stop until he reached his friend's house nearby, pounding on the door until it opened. Kenji collapsed inside, barely able to speak, his mind still reeling from what he had seen. The next day, Kenji quit his job. He couldn't bring himself to return to that train, to that station. The image of the woman, the blood, and that dragging sound would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had always been a rational man, but after that night, nothing could convince him that what he saw wasn't real. He was traumatized, forever scarred by the memory of that night and the horror that had pursued him on that empty train. And that wraps up today's dive into Japan's spine-chilling folklore. These stories remind us that every culture has its own haunting tales that are worth respecting and exploring. If you enjoyed getting creeped out, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and may the mysteries of the supernatural continue to captivate your imagination. This is Supernatural Secrets signing off.